article I chose to discuss is titled "The Really Big One" from the New Yorker. In this article, the author begins by describing the giant earthquake in 2011 in Japan, and then the author goes on to say that there is a sort of a fault line in North America called Cascadia subduction zone that could potentially trigger a giant earthquake in the future, anytime in the future. I think the main point of this article is to introduce these facts about this zone and also raise public awareness that building preventative infrastructures to reduce the damage done by these giant earthquakes in the future is pretty necessary. So that's the main point of this article. And for the question about the interpretive biases, well, I think I do have some personal interpretive bias because I grew up in a region where earthquakes are pretty frequent. And I personally experienced a giant earthquake in 2008 in Chengdu where more than 30,000 people have died. So when I read this article, when I read this description of this article, I am more likely to believe what the author tried to say. I think the author presents a very convincing case in which coming up with preventative measures against these sort of big earthquakes in the future is necessary. So yeah, that's the influence of my interpretive biases. Um, were you able to reduce the effects of my interpretation? Well, I don't think so. Um, I think even though some of the descriptions on the giant earthquake in this passage are completely imaginary, for example, let's see this paragraph in which the author describes the imaginary situation when that giant earthquake happens. Well, for people who have never experienced a giant earthquake, I think this is completely imaginary. But for me, a person who has personally experienced one, I think this description is pretty vivid and even sort of precise. So I couldn't detach myself from feeling, from that emotional feeling. So I'm not able to reduce these sort of effects on my interpretation of this article until I did some research online, which I'll talk about later. Now let's move on to the next question. What did you learn about the context of this article that changed my interpretation of it? So I learned that this article is published in the New Yorker, which is a literary magazine whose audience is usually upper and middle class readers who are fans of literature. The New Yorker is not as scientifically precise and convincing as magazines such as Nature and the Scientific American. So knowing this context, I find that the case that the author made seems less convincing than I originally thought. Because it's a literary magazine, not the scientific one, and I could not find any scientific justifications in this article that describe this fault line. So let's move to the last question. What attitudes does the author have towards this subject? Well, I think the overall tone of this passage is pretty dismal. Let's look at the fourth paragraph. In this paragraph, the author describes his experience in a Japanese earthquake in 2011. So look at the word choice. There is chill, there is snow. Also, there's the earth snapped, popped, and rippled, which describes the fierceness of this earthquake. And also, let's return back to the imaginary scene of the giant earthquake in the future. So there is tsunami, there is inundation zone. I mean, all of the phrases and word choices in this article seems to point to the truth that the situation will not be good in the future. It's not optimistic. So that's the attitude of the author. And then for the question, does the work present the truth? Well, I don't think so. After doing some research, I found a similar article in Scientific American, which also describes the Cascadia subduction zone. Although this article takes on a very relaxing tone. For example, let's see the first paragraph. A slow earthquake? Did you even know an earthquake could be slow? And also the third paragraph. But no, I'm totally relaxed. This is all completely normal stuff for this area. Well, this article takes on a completely opposite tone as the article we are discussing in the New Yorker. But then, since this article is published in the Scientific American, which is more scientifically precise and convincing than the New Yorker, I think that well, this article may not have presented the whole truth. Maybe the author is trying to be more dramatic about the events that can take place in the future. Okay, so that's my answer.